There's sure a lot of talk about the dollar, but what are people really referring to? Is the dollar's global reserve currency status ending? What will a dollar purchase in the real world? The dollar has three main aspects to it: domestic purchasing power, foreign exchange rate, and the strength of the dollar's network as the global reserve currency. Today, we'll break down each component to hopefully give some more insight on that thing that plays such a central role in your life, the dollar. So the first component we'll look at is the exchange rate value of the dollar. And generally, when people talk about this, they look at the DXY. This is a measure of the dollar versus other fiat currencies, and the amount that $1 will get you of these other currencies. This is the strength of a currency in the exchange rate definition. And the DXY is kind of an outdated metric that hasn't been updated in a while. The basket of currencies that they compare the dollar to is kind of outdated, and we don't trade as much with those countries anymore. So the euro makes up about 55%, Japanese yen about 15%, the British pound about 12, Canadian dollar about 10. The Swedish krona and the Swiss franc each make up about 4% of this index here. And what I want to show here in yellow is the Plaza Accords. So we can see that the dollar strengthened dramatically in the early 80s. And part of this was driven by high rates. We can see here in purple the US Treasury, 10-year Treasury yield. Historically, we had very, very high rates under Paul Volcker and the kind of stagflation and all that. Well, this caused the dollar to strengthen because global capital wants the highest interest rate it can get. And if the US is offering that, it will lead to people selling their euros or their yen for dollars to buy dollars, pushing the value of the dollar up. And we've looked at exchange interest rate differentials a lot and their effect on exchange rates. We won't go into it a ton right here in this video. But following that strengthening, we had the Plaza Accord, where a bunch of countries' finance ministers got together and said, "Hey, the dollar's too strong," or put another way, these other currencies are too weak, and we need to address that. Because remember, there's two sides to this coin. There is the effect that it has on exports and the effect that it has on imports. A strong dollar means that it is more cost effective for us to buy from the rest of the world. That might sound great. The other side of the coin, though, is that it makes it that much more expensive for the rest of the world to buy our stuff made in America. And this is something that we've talked about a lot, Triffin's dilemma and all that. I won't go into it in depth here, but this white line shows the value of the dollar, the D as measured by the DXY index. And a lot of people kind of criticize this DXY index and say it's outdated. It doesn't really show, the true value of the dollar as measured by with our trading partners. Who do we actually do trade with? And let's give a weight to those currencies. Well, here is the advanced economies in purple, and then the dollar versus emerging market currencies. You can see the correlation is very tight. It almost looks basically like the same line. This is only by direction of travel. So here we can look at the relative performance since 2006 of the dollar versus emerging market currencies in red and advanced countries currencies in purple. And what we see is that, yes, the dollar has strengthened since 2005. It is strengthened no matter which one you look at, if it's advanced economies or emerging market economies. But the dollar versus emerging market currencies has strengthened significantly more, almost double. So the dollar has strengthened versus advanced market currencies. Think of the pound or the euro or the yen by about 13%. Well, versus emerging market currencies, the dollar has strengthened by 34% in that same time. So while the direction of travel might be the same, and there might look to be a very tight correlation, if you look at it in this way, once you account for the percentage change over time, you can see this pretty clear divergence where emerging market currencies started to get really weak in the mid 2010s. There's arguments that these were manipulated, and this is something that the Trump administration, the current administration, talks about when they talk about the non-tariff barriers. That's one of the components they're talking about is the value of these foreign currencies, in their opinion, is too weak. So the other component of, oh, I want to touch on one last thing here. So to make a real world example here, what I did is I came up with this kind of silly example, but just to hopefully illustrate this exchange rate portion. So assume $1 will buy you €1. Okay. Now assume a Corvette here, made here in America, costs $100,000 in US dollars. Now think of a German banker, and he makes 100,000 euros per year. Well, on that 100,000 euro per year salary, he can buy one Corvette every year, right? Because it's 1 to 1. The exchange rate is 1 to 1. Well, now imagine that the dollar strengthens, where $1 gets you €2. Put another way, the dollar strengthened, but the euro weakened, right? If you're European, now, if you're that German banker, now your salary didn't change. You're only making 100,000 euros per year. Your salary didn't change. But because the exchange rate changed, now you can only buy one Corvette every 2 years. So the purchasing power of that for that foreigner, it went down. And when people talk about exporting inflation, the U.S. exports inflation to the rest of the world. This is kind of the concept they're trying to describe. Put another way, though, we can see the effect that it would have on U.S. domestic manufacturing, which is, Chevy is not selling as many Corvettes, right? Because now the dollar strengthened, and that European banker can't buy as many or as often. So the other main component here that's really important, and I would argue most everyday Americans feel when they hear the dollar, this is what they think about. They think of the purchasing power of their dollar, especially over the past 5 years, given inflation. And so here, there, I want to kind of illustrate just a very basic concept, which is there are ways to measure the total amount of money in the system. So in purple, we have currency in circulation. This is coins and dollar bills, $100 bills, right? Currency, real, official dollar currency. We can see it makes up about $2.3 trillion. Well, let's go one measure kind of more broad, right? Let's start to include other official dollar measures. And we'll look at the M0. This is sometimes called the monetary base. This includes all those currencies, but it also adds in bank reserves. A bank reserve, say you're a big bank, Wells Fargo, US Bank, Chase, you have an account at the Federal Reserve. And in that account, it's basically a checking account for the bank. In that account are what are called bank reserves. And so M0 takes currency in circulation, and it also adds in these bank reserves. And we can see that once you do that, the kind of official US dollar money supply is 5.7 trillion. Well, let's go even one measure broader, which is M2 money supply. This is arguably the one that's used the most. It has kind of the best real world implications. M2 money supply starts to include other components too. In addition to the currency in circulation, the bank reserves, it also includes savings accounts, time deposits, money market funds, right? Things that are liquid, checking deposits, where you can go to your bank and withdraw it. Right, and you get real dollars that you can spend as real dollars. M2 starts to include kind of even more aspects of the dollar. Well, what do we see? It's $22 trillion. Well, but we established the actual physical currency is only 2.3 trillion. What this means is that the amount of M2 is about 10x levered to the actual amount of physical currency, right? Or about 4x levered to the monetary base. And this is official, bank reserves that create, real official US dollars can't get more official than bank reserves, and currency. You're about 4x levered, right? For every dollar in your checking account, savings account, money market fund, or whatever, for every $4 in your checking account, only one of them is actually kind of real, quote unquote, or official. People may kind of dispute that terminology, but hopefully the concept here is clear. Well, there's actually even more dollars than measured by M2, right? If you own a house and you want to sell that house, you're going to get dollars. If you own 100 shares of Apple stock or Google and you sell those shares, you're going to get dollars right away. So once you start to include all those sorts of metrics or value, now you're talking about called an M4 money supply of 150, 200 trillion dollars. And remember, there's only 2 trillion of currency, and there's only 5 trillion of actual kind of official bank reserves and currency, right? So, what I'm trying to illustrate here is the degree to which the money supply is leveraged off of a relatively small number of official dollars. Well, here is kind of the impact of the money supply. So here in white, we have the purchasing power of the dollar going back to 1913. And then in red, we have one measure of consumer price inflation, which is the CPI index. And this red line shows the actual index. So a lot of people don't know this, but CPI is actually this red line. It is not the year over year change. That is not what the actual CPI index is. And you can see that they have an inverse relationship as CPI, as the index goes up. This is the cumulative inflation or the cumulative loss in purchasing power, as illustrated by the white line, and they are inverse. Well, these are regular. The red line is a regular chart. Let's put it in logarithmic form. So this accounts for exponential changes. I'll throw the purchasing power in regular form. So it's just asymptotic down and to the right. Purchasing power has been lost relentlessly, going back all the way to the Great Depression. But accounting for exponential changes and looking at it in log, we can see two things. One, when people talk about prices going down, what they mean is this red line going down, right? That is what people actually feel is prices going down. Well, in order to have that happen, like we see this, hopefully your eye went to this period of time. This was, the Great Depression. And there was a recession before the Great Depression too, and prices went down because the economy was shrinking and there was deflation. A lot of times in the mainstream media, this point is lost, right? Where it's like, well, everyone wants prices to go down, but if it means a recession, do people still want prices to go down? Right? This is really the question that it should be framed in that sort of way, because generally speaking, we have inflation. The system we live in is inflationary. Unfortunately, we are constantly losing purchasing power in our dollars. So, a lot of people will say the CPI index vastly underestimates actual inflation. And the reason for this is the government gets to create their own metric, right? Their own basket. And they go, well, beef. Let's say, people 5%, right? Beef prices will make up 5% of the CPI index. Well, let's say that steaks are start shooting up in price, right? Increasing rapidly. Well, what they can do, and they have done this dozens, hundreds of times, they call it substitutions, is they go, well, people don't really need a steak. We'll count ground beef, right? Ground beef is increasing much less rapidly. It's much more stable price. People don't really need a steak. They just, ground beef's fine. It's still beef, and they substitute, right? So they can make all of these kind of modifications. Some would say manipulations. And influence the CPI index. And people argue, when CPI was 9% year over year, everyone I knew felt like inflation was 15, 16, 17, 18%. And so there's a degree to which the CPI index is incorrect in measuring actual inflation. Well, one of the ways we can look at that is to take the actual monetary supply and divide it by CPI. And another way of doing it is taking gold, which, remember, gold doesn't change in value. When the gold price goes up, gold did not get any more valuable. It's still just a shiny rock. Very pretty shiny rock, but it's still just a shiny rock. Is not getting any more valuable. The difference in the price is the dollar is losing purchasing power. When the gold price goes up, that is not gold getting more valuable. That is the dollar losing purchasing power. And by doing this, we get a number. And I chose 1990. This is when my silent depression video kind of focused on this period of time, the past 30, 35 years. And what we can see is that both of them, that the gold measure, on a day to day or week to week basis, there is idiosyncratic issues with gold. So you can't really use it on a day to day, week to week, even month to month basis. But over decades, we can see that it actually comes fairly close to estimating actual monetary inflation, which we see here in the M2 money supply. So what this chart shows is that the M2 money supply, the actual money supply, remember, inflation is a monetary phenomenon. The actual money supply increased by 172% in the past 30, 35 years, faster than CPI, right? The money supply increased much more than 172% in the past 30, 35 years. What this shows is that the money supply increased 172% faster than the official government CPI index, and gold 221% faster. So that's the purchasing power of the dollar. Um, the third component, and stick around to the end because there's some pretty crazy charts that might surprise you on this question, right? A lot of people are going, well, is the dollar's reserve status done? Is it losing its reserve status? Is it over for the dollar? I try not to subscribe to any of that kind of doomer sort of narrative, and just look at it objectively. And I do not believe that there's this imminent collapse in the dollar as reserve currency. But it's important to when we talk about this third component of the dollar, what we're basically talking about is the dollar's network, right? Its strength as a global network. And here we have the current account. So remember, the main component of the current account is the balance of trade, or the trade deficit or trade surplus. We can see we have ran a massive current account deficit, excuse me, for many decades. Well, what this is indicating is that the value of imports, the value of the stuff that we're buying from the rest of the world, greatly outpaces the value of stuff we're selling to them. And so that gap, by the way, needs to come up. We need to come up with $300 billion a quarter somehow. And the way we do that, one of the ways we do that, is by running a capital account surplus. This is just it's just a mirror image of the current account. And this is the capital account surplus. A lot of people have been talking about this recently. I've been talking about it for like 2 years. I've done a lot of work on my X with correlations and various kind of evaluations and analysis of this dynamic, and I think it's still massively underappreciated. So when it comes to wealth inequality and hyperfinancialization, some of these concepts. So if you want, I can do another video on that, or you can check my X account. But this is a huge driver, right? $300 billion a quarter must get pumped into our capital markets to balance our current account deficit. What this is great for Wall Street. This is great for the wealthy who hold, a ton of financial assets. There is this kind of structural bid that is pumping their bags. But the other way to think about this is that the current account deficit, right, is demand for dollars. When foreigners start putting money back into U.S. capital markets, they're buying dollars, right? Whether that's a U.S. Treasury bond, a short-term Treasury bill, or I would argue even real estate, right? Because if a foreigner wants to buy U.S. real estate, they have to buy a dollar first. They have to sell their local currency to buy a dollar to buy the real estate or to buy the stock. So this can kind of illustrate the demand for dollars from the rest of the world. So someone mentioned this, the petrodollar and the correlation with oil. So very, very briefly, the petrodollar was something we kind of set up many decades ago, where we got the world to transact in oil denominated in dollars. Meaning, if you're a foreigner, you have to buy dollars to buy oil. Okay. I won't go into too much depth here. If people are interested, maybe we can do more on this particular topic. But what I want to illustrate is the USD euro exchange rate, and that is here in red. And hopefully you can see how tight that correlation is. There's a number of reasons for this. I've actually done quite a bit of work on oil and the effect that it has on currencies and bond yields. So if people are interested, leave a comment. Maybe I can do a more in-depth video on this particular topic. But remember, if oil must be transacted in dollars, that will drive demand for dollars. And Europe and Japan are both net energy importers. They are, on a net basis, generally speaking, they are short oil. And we can see that the effect that this has not only on currencies but on bond yields too. So if people are interested in that, I can go into do another video on it. But trying to keep this brief. So here we have the foreign debt, the debt, the treasury debt that foreigners hold, divided by the total government debt. And what this shows is the relative share that foreigners own, right? Both, we know our national debt has been going parabolic, exponential, excuse me. We also know that foreigners, buy some of that debt. Well, what this chart shows is, are the foreigners buying more on a relative basis, right? Then the total debt is increasing. If foreign governments start buying even more debt than they had been, and that number is increasing faster than the total debt is increasing, this white line will go up, right? This means that they are out of the total debt. They are buying more of that total debt. We can see currently it's about 23%. And what we can see is, going back to 1970, in general, this line went up and to the right. As we issued debt, foreigners bought it. Well, what happened in 2014? This peaked at 35%. So at the peak in 2014, 35% of our total debt was held by foreigners. What has happened over the past 10, 11 years? This has been declining. This line has been declining, right? Foreigners are buying. They might still be buying some of our debt, but our debt is increasing faster than the amount of the rate at which they are swallowing up that debt. So here is a chart from the IMF. This shows here in blue, this is the DXY index we were looking at in the first slide. Here, though, shows the share that the dollar makes up in global FX reserves. What's an FX reserve? If you are China or Japan or Saudi Arabia or Taiwan, you run a huge current account surplus, right? The opposite of what we do here in America. Money and wealth is flowing into your country. And by definition, you're not using that money or that wealth to buy imports from the rest of the world. That's why it's a surplus. And so you need to save somehow. Well, foreign exchange reserves is, generally speaking, kind of a way to think about that. This is the savings of the FX reserves, are the savings of all of these current account surplus countries. And here in red is an exchange rate and interest rate adjusted share of the dollar in those reserves. We can see in 2000, it made up 71% of those reserves. Well, what's happened since then? It has declined. It has been declining for 25 years, right? And it really kind of accelerated in this 2014 era. Hopefully, you can see the slope of that line start to accelerate. This is a trend that has been in place for a long time. This is not a new dynamic. Here is kind of that same concept that we were just looking at here. But it's cool because what it does is it points out who has been buying, right? We established that foreigners kind of started stepping away in 2014, 2013, 2014. But look at the debt. The debt has skyrocketed since then. So it makes you think, okay, well, if the debt's skyrocketed, who's been buying? If the foreigners kind of step back, who has been buying? Well, we can see net of the Fed, this has been the Federal Reserve has stepped in to fill that gap through quantitative easing and printing money, basically, to buy bonds. Here is the US dollar share of global reserve currency. Again, this is just kind of a simpler way of looking at it. And we can see, again, going in 2014, this was really kind of when things started to change. It made up 66% of those total savings of the surplus countries. 66%. And we can see now it's currently about 59%. This only goes to 2023. I believe it's declined since 2023. Here is a really cool chart. And if anyone has an updated to this, please let me know. This goes back to 2022. But here we see all these different components, right? We see the dollar, gold, sterling, which is the Great British pound. This was the reserve currency before the dollar. Yen, franc, Deutschmark, which doesn't exist anymore, the euro, renminbi is the Chinese yuan, and then other. And what we can see, look at the gold bars. You can see that they made up a huge share of these global savings. This starts in 1900, going all the way through to the Second World War. Gold made up like 85, 90% of these total global savings. What happened after World War II? It dropped dramatically, right? And now was down to close to 70%, and ever since then has been falling pretty precipitously. And what's been taking its place? The dollar, right? We see that in red. We see that here, leading into World War II, it made up a very small portion of global savings, global FX reserves. But we can see that its share grew dramatically. Well, what started happening around that same period of time, 2013, 2014, we can see gold starts increasing, right? Central banks start allocating more and more to gold and less to dollars. You can see this red line kind of starts to curve, right, and form like a bowl. And it's starting to decrease, right? These red bars are getting shorter, meaning the dollar is making up less. It's important to point out euro. A lot of people kind of forget about the euro. It's a pretty decent size share of total FX reserves, but the renminbi, the Chinese yuan, is very, very tiny, right? Very, very tiny. So here is a chart by Tavi Costa. He's really great follow. I appreciate his work, but it's the same chart we were looking at before here with the debt held by foreigners as a share of total debt. We see that in white, and then in blue we see gold. The share that gold is making up in these total FX reserves. And we can see just at the same time that it peaked, right? The total treasury holdings peaked, gold started to increase as a share of total savings, total FX reserves. And it's important, I almost missed this. So, really important point here. 2012 to 2013, this was following the great financial crisis. And 2012 here. So 2012, 2013, the peak right here. This was following a great financial crisis. The economy was not doing too well. We were engaged in ZIRP, zero interest rate policy, quantitative easing, where the Federal Reserve was creating money to buy assets like treasury bonds to push yields down, buying mortgage-backed securities. The Federal Reserve holds about $2 trillion still of mortgage-backed securities. We should push that goes to zero as quickly as possible. And they were buying these assets. Well, quantitative easing, there were multiple programs. There was QE1, and then they kind of engaged in a bout of these purchases, and then kind of it tapered off, and they decided they needed to do another QE. So that was QE2, all right? And there were a number of these QEs. In QE2, if memory serves, was about $600 billion, which at the time was a lot of money. QE3 was really when they stepped in. That was $1.2 trillion, if memory serves. It was certainly over 1 trillion. I think it was 1.2, 1.3 trillion. So significantly large QE, quantitative easing operation. And that was in 2012, 2013. And what do you know? That was the peak in this particular, as a share of total US Treasury debt, of total national debt, the foreign holdings they peaked during QE2 and QE3. We kind of signaled how we were going to behave fiscally and from a monetary policy sort of way. So this final chart here, this is, hopefully people stuck around to the end because this is pretty crazy. So this takes the IMF's PPP estimate. What is a PPP? Purchasing Power Parity. This shows it's an effort or an attempt to estimate the purchasing power of each currency. And what we can see is that we mentioned the Plaza Accord, right? In the DXY chart, you will remember that the dollar was ripping higher, just on a meteoric streak. And then the Plaza, it got too strong. Other currencies got too weak. And we needed the Plaza Accord here in 1985. Well, this shows that same rise, right? I think this is a moving average of the DXY because it's kind of smoothed out. And it peaked in 1985, Plaza Accord, dollar weakened. And then it ripped again into the kind of dot-com bubble. and then it weakened. So what this shows over here on the scale is the overvaluation of the DXY versus the IMF's purchasing power parity estimate. And what we see is that at the peak of that, right before the Plaza Accord, it was about 85% overvalued. And then we can see the peak here in the kind of early 2000s. It reached a similar peak of about 85%. Well, what do we see here? We are about, as of 2023, about 90% overvalued based on the IMF, the International Monetary Fund's purchasing power parity scale. This means, and I've been calling for a Mar-a-Lago Accord or some sort of global monetary reordering way before it even had a name, back in the summer of last year is when I started kind of talking about this concept, because I think it is the only way out. It is the only way to truly reform the system. It is the only way to correct for imbalances, structural issues with the dollar, right? This reserve currency status is what's part of what's killing our country. This is what Robert Triffin, a Belgian economist, warned America in a report, and I've read the report. It was issued in the early '60s. So this dynamic of an ever strengthening dollar, an ever increasing trade deficit or current account deficit, to get those dollars to the rest of the world, all of these things were foreseen. And in fact, we were warned that we would hollow out our industrial base and ship all the good paying jobs off to foreign countries and subsidize their middle class at the expense of our own. All of these dynamics that we see, wealth inequality, right? The capital account surplus driving wealth inequality to historic levels. All of these things are relatively straightforward concepts. They're not really disputed in economics, and they were foreseen back in the '60s, and we were warned about it, and we didn't listen. And both parties have engaged in this king dollar approach, right? Ever strengthening dollar. We're going to wield it as a weapon, and if you don't play along, we will take down your entire economy. See Turkey, see Iran, right? You can go through the list. Venezuela. We have crashed entire economies at the tequila crisis. We've crashed entire economies with the dollar and used it as a weapon, as this kind of imperialistic weapon, no different than armed conflict. And I think that the world clearly has been moving away, right, for 10 years, 10, 11 years. We saw that with some of the charts we were looking at before. Um, Here, right, gold has started to increase going back to QE2, QE3, when we signaled how we are going to approach fiscal and monetary policy. The central banks started buying gold, governments around the world started buying gold. Um, and look, I think it's the only way out. So not only does the dollar have all these issues, this resource curse, this Dutch disease, on the dollar side, the structural overvaluation of the dollar by 90%. Not only that, but other currencies have structural issues. You look at China and the claims that they manipulate their currency, and they're not the only ones. Taiwan is another. You can go down the list. Many countries, the yen, for example, on a purchasing power parity basis, should be about 110, 120, and is currently down from a peak of 160, meaning it still has a long way to go before it's at its correct level of strength. It has been strengthening for the past 6, 9 months, but right, this is not just China. This is not just Japan. The number of countries, because remember, it helps them. It helps them to have a weak currency. And so there's a number of ways they go about this, but they're kind of manipulating their currencies to be weaker than they should be. And their economies need to reorient more towards domestic consumption, and stronger currencies. And our country needs to reorient towards less reliance on imported plastic trinkets and the ability to rebuild our industrial base. So, from a defense standpoint, we can actually make enough weapons. God forbid we have to go to war. We can actually make enough computer chips that go into everything nowadays. We don't have to rely on China for 65% of our active pharmaceutical ingredients, right? You go down the list, it's a national security imperative, to say nothing of the fact that these foreign countries own own us. They own our debt. They own our U.S. Treasury debt. They own our corporate debt. They own our U.S. equities. Right? We've talked about these dynamics a number of times. So there's a number of national security elements to it, in addition to the societal elements of an ever increasing suicide rate, ever increasing antidepressant prescriptions. Right? Like deaths of despair that are double what they were in the Great Depression. Um, all of these things, right? The current system is clearly not working. It's not working if you're a part of the bottom 90% in America. It's not working for you. It's not working for America as a whole, right? As a nation, we've talked about those issues with the debt, with kind of Triffin's dilemma and hollowing out the industrial base and being totally exposed, right? We basically lost a proxy war to a country with 1/12 of our GDP because we can't make anything anymore. They have 1/12 of our GDP, and right. So all of these dynamics, it's a national security element to it. And I think that America as a nation understands the current system isn't working. And not only that, but the other countries like China also recognize the current system is broken. They have been talking about a need to reorient their economy towards domestic consumption. They've been talking about that for like 6 or 7 years. They themselves have been saying this. So there is a moment, I think, for all of us to get together and hopefully try to reform this system. And it comes down to the dollar strength on a foreign exchange level, right? In this FX level. It doesn't necessarily have an effect on this. Now, I think it will in the implementation they will use, which is to devalue all fiat currencies, will probably be devalued in my version of a Mar-a-Lago Accord. It's just that certain currencies will be devalued versus gold more. And I think that that's likely how it plays out. But it is possible to have a weaker dollar and purchasing power, not change notably. They are interconnected dynamics, right? The purchasing power, the money supply, the exchange rate, all of them are interconnected, but they're somewhat independent. They can be independent. And so anyway, so I think that, hopefully that was helpful in explaining what the dollar actually is. There are a number of ways, when people say the dollar, they could be referring to a number of different things. It depends on kind of their day to day life, right? What impacts them. Most everyday Americans are not impacted by unless you're traveling to Europe or buying goods directly from a foreign country. You're not really impacted as much by the foreign exchange kind of version of the dollar as you are the purchasing power based on the money supply and kind of deficit spending and all that. This is what really affects 90% of kind of everyday Americans. But if you're a wealthy person, this third version of the dollar, this demand for dollars from foreigners, this is pumping your bags. So you probably really like having a strong dollar as the reserve currency. So, anyways, hopefully that was helpful, educational, insightful. If any of those topics were interesting and want kind of a deeper dive on any of that, just leave a comment and I'll catch you next one.